Sergeant Marshall assumed he had apprehended just another cocky black man. But within hours, his entire world would crumble, and his name would make headlines nationwide. Why? Because the man he had slapped handcuffs on wasn't just any driver. He was the Attorney General. What followed left even the most seasoned observers utterly astounded. But let's rewind to the very start. Sergeant Dan Marshall stretched idly in his patrol car, his eyes scanning the quiet, almost deserted road. His shift had been uneventful, and he was itching for something to break the monotony. His gaze latched onto a sleek black sedan gliding past, just a bit quicker than the other vehicles. Behind the wheel was a well-dressed black man, exuding an air of confidence that struck a nerve. Marshall's lips curled into a smirk. He hated seeing people like that, acting as if the rules didn't apply to them. "Got one," he muttered, flipping on his patrol lights. The sedan complied immediately, pulling over smoothly. To Marshall's irritation, the driver showed no sign of anxiety. Instead, he sat composed, his calm demeanor only fueling the officer's irritation. Marshall sauntered up to the car and tapped on the window. "License and registration," he demanded. The man silently handed over the requested documents, maintaining an air of quiet composure. "Is there an issue, officer?" he asked, his tone even. "You were speeding," Marshall lied, his voice laced with authority. The driver raised a brow, his tone measured but firm. "I was going 35 in a 40 zone." That response, paired with its self-assured delivery, set Marshall's teeth on edge. He loathed it when black men spoke to him as equals. His gaze swept through the interior of the car. It was spotless. No contraband, no weapons, nothing out of place. He clicked his tongue in frustration. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. "On what grounds?" the driver replied, his voice calm but unwavering. "Don't make me use force," Marshall snapped, his hand drifting toward the cuffs on his belt. The man stepped out, his movements deliberate and measured, placing his hands on the hood of the car. "You're making a mistake, officer." "Oh, I'll be the judge of that," Marshall sneered, twisting the man's arm and snapping on the cuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting." The man didn't resist, didn't even flinch, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet, assessing intensity, that sent an unfamiliar shiver through Marshall. It wasn't fear, it was something far more unsettling. "You'll regret this," the man stated calmly. Marshall laughed dismissively, leading him toward the patrol car. He had no inkling of just how prophetic those words would soon prove to be. Inside the precinct, Marshall paraded his detainee down the hallway with a smug sense of satisfaction. This was his favorite part, watching people's expressions change as they realized they were in serious trouble. "Take a seat, boss," Marshall said mockingly, shoving the man into a stiff metal chair in the interrogation room. The detainee, who introduced himself as Derek, sat upright, his arms crossed with a quiet confidence. He didn't fidget, didn't beg for a phone call, didn't yell in anger. Instead, his calm demeanor unnerved Marshall. Most people cracked under pressure, but this man was different. His silence spoke volumes. "Name?" Marshall asked lazily, as he started filling out a report. "Derek Williams," the man replied evenly. Marshall's pen froze momentarily. The name rang a bell, but he couldn't quite place it. He pushed the thought aside, smirking as he continued. "You act like you're someone important," Marshall sneered. "Think that fancy suit means anything here?" Derek simply glanced at him, a faint, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He didn't dignify the comment with a response, which only further irritated Marshall. "All right, Mr. Big Shot," Marshall muttered, heading to the duty desk. There, Officer Johnson was busy inputting the detainee's information into the precinct's system. Suddenly, Johnson stiffened, his eyes widening as if he'd seen a ghost. "Dan, do you know who you just arrested?" Johnson's voice trembled. "What are you talking about?" Marshall asked, his annoyance growing. Johnson wordlessly turned the monitor toward him. There, staring back from the screen, was an official government portrait of Derek Williams, accompanied by a bold title, State Attorney General. The color drained from Marshall's face as icy dread settled in. "You're kidding, right?" he muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. Johnson shook his head. "You just arrested the top legal officer in this state, the man who oversees us. The guy who fights corruption and abuses of power, and you accused him of resisting arrest on a bogus charge." Marshall's stomach twisted. "Maybe he'll let it slide," he offered weakly. "Are you insane?" Johnson hissed. "Look outside." Marshall turned toward the window and felt his blood run cold. A sea of journalists had already gathered outside the precinct, cameras flashing, microphones ready. Just then, the door to the interrogation room creaked open. Derek emerged, flanked by the lieutenant and the precinct chief. "Officer Marshall," Derek began, his voice calm but commanding, "I suggest you start looking for a competent lawyer." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and placed it on the desk in front of a dumbstruck Marshall. "Oh, and one more thing," Derek added, leaning in just slightly. "I'll personally attend your hearing." Marshall couldn't muster a response. He could only watch as Derek walked out of the precinct, cameras clicking and reporters shouting in a frenzy. And in that moment, Marshall realized his career wasn't just in jeopardy. It was over. "Exactly. You fabricated the charges. I was just doing my job," Marshall blurted out, his voice cracking with desperation. The moment the words left his mouth, regret washed over him. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Order in the court," the judge commanded, her tone sharp and unyielding. Derek Williams stood unshaken, his voice steady but cutting. "The truth is, Sergeant, you are not just an individual offender. You are a byproduct of a system that has enabled and concealed police misconduct for decades. Today, this courtroom isn't just deciding your fate. It's sending a message to those who've suffered silently under the weight of systemic injustice." Marshall clenched his fists under the table, resisting the urge to respond. His face burned with humiliation, but his silence was born of helplessness. The weight of the room, the cameras, the whispers, the eyes boring into him, was unbearable. An hour later, the judge delivered her verdict, her voice cold and final. "Sergeant Daniel Marshall, you are hereby suspended from duty, effective immediately. Furthermore, a criminal case against you for abuse of power will be opened." Marshall felt the words crush him like a ton of bricks. The ground beneath him seemed to vanish as his career, his identity, disintegrated in a single sentence. Williams stood without a glance in his direction, gathering his papers and exiting the courtroom. The scandal was far from over. It had only just begun. 2 weeks had passed since the trial, but for Marshall, it felt like an eternity. He sat in his dimly lit, smoke-filled apartment, staring blankly at the flickering TV screen. "Police scandal. Racist arrest of Attorney General," the anchor announced with a tone of restrained outrage. On screen, a picture of Marshall appeared alongside Derek Williams, his expression plastered next to damning headlines. "Son of a—" Marshall muttered bitterly, reaching for a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table. The burn of the alcohol did little to dull the sting of betrayal. He had always assumed the system would protect him, shield him from the consequences of his actions. But now that the public was watching, the same system had turned its back on him. The next morning, Marshall swiped his badge at the precinct entrance, only to be met with the soulless beep of denial. A receptionist nearby avoided meeting his gaze. "Sergeant," she said softly, her voice tinged with discomfort, "you're suspended. You're not allowed access to the station." "This is all politics," Marshall snapped, his frustration boiling over. "I was following orders. You know that." The receptionist hesitated before responding, her voice barely above a whisper. "Orders from above, Dan. They want you at headquarters." At headquarters, Marshall was met with a grim scene. The police commissioner, flanked by lawyers, waiting for him. Their expressions left no room for doubt. He wasn't walking out of here unscathed. "Sergeant Marshall," the commissioner began, his tone formal and devoid of sympathy. "You're under internal investigation." Marshall exhaled sharply, his frustration bubbling into anger. "Because of that damn Williams?" The commissioner shook his head, his expression hard. "Not just Williams. We've reviewed your past cases, complaints, violations, video footage. Dan, you've drawn too much attention. We can't cover for you anymore." "You're throwing me under the bus?" Marshall spat, his voice rising. "After 20 years of service, this is how you repay me? You've served the system for 20 years." The commissioner replied coldly. And now the system won't protect you. You're toxic, Dan. The department needs a clean slate. Marshall felt the words like a punch to the gut. Everything he'd built, every corner he'd cut, had come back to haunt him. His voice trembled as he spoke. You're just discarding me like trash. The commissioner's expression didn't waver. It's not personal, it's politics. A week later, the hammer came down hard. Marshall was officially charged with multiple offenses: excessive force, falsified reports, and systematic discrimination. His lawyer didn't sugarcoat the reality. Dan, this is serious, the attorney said, sliding a stack of legal papers across the table. Plead guilty. Take a deal. You'll get probation, but you'll lose your badge for good. Marshall shook his head, his pride refusing to concede. I'm not pleading guilty to this nonsense. Without a word, the lawyer pulled out a phone and pressed play. On the screen, a recorded audio file began to play. It was Marshall's own voice. They're always hiding something. Keep them scared. Marshall's stomach twisted. His own words had betrayed him. This isn't a setup, the lawyer said firmly. This is accountability. The final trial was a public spectacle. Cameras documented every second, and the courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and curious spectators. Marshall sat rigid at the defense table, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He avoided the probing eyes of the crowd, keeping his gaze locked on the table before him. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The formalities began, and it wasn't long before the verdict was announced. Daniel Marshall, the judge said, her voice echoing in the tense silence, the court finds you guilty on all counts. You are permanently barred from law enforcement and sentenced to 3 years of probation. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, a mix of shock, approval, and vindication. Some members of the audience clapped, their applause restrained but meaningful. Marshall stared blankly at the floor, the reality of his downfall finally sinking in. The most cutting blow, however, came as he looked up to see Derek Williams watching him. There was no anger, no triumph in the Attorney General's expression, just a cold, unwavering satisfaction. After the verdict, their paths crossed briefly in the courthouse hallway. "Happy now?" Marshall growled, his voice dripping with bitterness. Williams adjusted his cuffs, his tone calm and deliberate. "Justice has prevailed, Sergeant." "Go to hell!" Marshall snarled. Williams didn't even flinch. "The system didn't break you, Marshall. It just stopped working for you." With that, he walked away, leaving Marshall standing alone with his shattered illusions. Outside, reporters and spectators celebrated what they called a victory for justice. Cameras flashed, microphones captured every soundbite, and the public reveled in the spectacle of accountability. For Marshall, there was nothing left, only the hollow realization that his world had crumbled, and no one would save him.